Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, as I mentioned last week, I had 20-odd in-person meetings in New York City for my day job. I made it through. It was pretty exhausting. I seem to have dodged the COVID bullet, according to a couple of at-home tests 3 and 5 days after my last meetings. Honestly, I have not had a meeting schedule like this for 3 years, and back then I hadn't turned 50 yet, so it was all pretty tiring. I also saddled myself with some crazy travel logistics, but it all came out well. Lots of good catch-up meetings with members of my trade association, a couple of new members joining on the spot, a couple more prospectives who sound like they're going to join, and just some general banter with other pals and people I haven't seen in years and years and years. And you know, that's the sort of thing we all pretty sorely missed. The downside of this is, well, this event was held in a bunch of hotels in Midtown Manhattan, and everyone was maskless indoors, hotel lobbies, elevators, all that stuff. I stayed masked up in public areas, only took the mask off in hotel suites where we had our meetings, or, you know, if a guy didn't have a suite and we're meeting in a lobby, I'd say, hey, let's go out on the sidewalk and talk, and I'd take off the mask then. I know everyone's getting past the worst days of lockdown and everything, and I guess I'm just more risk averse than most people. That said, an industry pal who was not at the event emailed on Monday because he said he was looking at pictures that people were posting from this whole week on LinkedIn, and he noticed that I was the only person who was consistently masked in any pictures that he saw. If something came up and I was tagged, Gil's there, but he's all masked up. And he was wondering if anyone gave me guff about that because he was planning on trade show travel for the rest of this year and wondered what the vibe was like. I assume because he also wanted to stay somewhat protected. I told him no one was a dick about it. I did not tell him, because he doesn't know about my condition, that I was so ready to drop the I have leukemia card all week, but never had the opportunity. Nobody ever gave me any crap that led me to do it. So anyway, it was a good, tiring week. I'm awfully glad I recorded 2 shows the weekend before, last week's with Rebecca Mead and the current one, because there is no way I would have been in shape to do one this weekend, even a remote, not with all the reading that would have to go into prep and all the questions I'd have to write and everything that took me, you know, all week, Monday through Thursday to do, and then all the catch up for work I was doing on Friday and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time around is the art critic Sebastian Smee. He does not have a new book out, but I highly recommend his 2017 book, The Art of Rivalry: 4 Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art. The Art of Rivalry explores the relationships among, well, 4 pairs of artists, Freud and Bacon, Manet and Degas, Matisse and Picasso, and de Kooning and Pollock. And he gets into their interactions and the impact they have each on the other's art at key stages in their careers, and how the traditional received ideas of rivalry kind of transform into much subtler dynamics in each of these pairs of relationships. And it's a really entertaining book, and it does have a degree of dishiness about, you know, the gossip and the scandals of the artists' lives and the scenes they were in. But beyond that, I really did take a lot out of that book. So go give it a read. The Art of Rivalry by Sebastian Smee. Now, Sebastian is an art critic. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic at the Washington Post. And in addition to his reviews of current exhibitions, which are great, He's also got this series going at the Post called Great Works in Focus, where he explores a single piece of art, what makes it special to him, and why you ought to go see it. And we talk about that series and the series that preceded it when he was at the Boston Globe during the conversation. But I'll just say here, those pieces are wonderful and they're illuminating. They span a lot of different genres and eras, different types of art. It's really worth checking out. Sebastian's prose is, well, it's jargon free as we get into. But beyond that, his enthusiasm for the art and for the artists, it's right there on the page or screen, however you're checking it out. Yeah, I love the Great Works in Focus series. And the neat thing is, one of my pharma pals, who is also into my podcast life, we were corresponding the week before the New York City trip, and I mentioned this upcoming session and the Great Works series to him. So when we got together for one of those sidewalk conversations on Tuesday, he told me he'd checked out a few of the Great Works posts, and he had just plotzed and was ecstatic to see all the stuff. He'd barely ever seen any of them. And now he had all of these great pieces to go see and a whole bunch of different museums to visit. So I was awfully happy to see my worlds collide like that. Anyway, Sebastian and I, we connected on Twitter a little while back. I think it was around my Peter Sheldal episode, which is my point of entree for a lot of art critics, apparently. And I asked him at the time if he'd be up for recording or if he wanted to wait until his next book project came to fruition. But he said he's up for it now. So here we are. Now, as caveats go, the audio's fine. There is one thing that went wrong. About 70 minutes into the session, his computer froze. He lost the connection. Fortunately, when he logged back in, Zencastr had preserved the audio file on his computer and uploaded that to the cloud. Once I had that securely saved, duplicated, and put into a hard drive on the side, we started a second, shorter session. There'll be a little break. I'll point it out. Chances are you wouldn't even notice it if I edited well. But anyway, I always like pointing out the flaws. The funny thing is about that, I would have been really bummed if we had lost that conversation because it's a really good one, as you're going to hear in a minute. But at the same time, I was pretty sure during that break when we didn't know, when he was trying to log in and we didn't know if the audio had been saved and all this, I was pretty sure that we could get together and record another conversation that would be totally different, but just as entertaining and illuminating. So what I mean to say is I really enjoyed talking with Sebastian, and, we make noise about doing it again sometime, hopefully in person. I came out of this one thinking like I'd really met someone who I can vibe with and gets what I'm doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and, it sort of fits into his mission as a critic. Anyway, here's Sebastian's bio. Sebastian Smee is a Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic at The Washington Post and the author of The Art of Rivalry, 4 Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art. He worked at the Boston Globe from 2008 to 2016, teaches at Wellesley College, and has previously worked in London and Sydney for the Daily Telegraph, UK, The Guardian, The Spectator, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian, and The Monthly. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Sebastian Smee. I want to ask art criticism versus art history, art versus art world, but really, I guess we should just start with where you got your start in writing about art.
It happened in Australia, back in Sydney, where I went to college. I was born in Sydney, and then I moved to another city in Australia called Adelaide. And came back to study at Sydney University, and I studied art history there. I'd started doing English, and I just couldn't keep up with the reading. I'm a really slow reader, and I found it really hard. And that was honestly the only reason I turned to art. There was no real art in my background. But I really took to it. I just felt I I was responding to stuff that was going on. There were key early experiences, I guess, but I loved it. And I loved that you could be looking at pictures and feel like you were studying. You know, it wasn't this sort of onerous thing. But yeah, in journalism, I got my start shortly after graduating, when in a bit of a panic, looking for work, feeling that I really wanted to be a writer. I dropped law in order to sort of try to carve out a career as a writer, but I didn't know how I was going to do that. And I'd written a couple of things that I'd somehow got placed in magazines, but not on art, on film and stuff like that. In that panic, with my parents kind of looking on askance, I wrote a bunch of letters to editors at various magazines and newspapers around Sydney, and to a few writers that I admired as well. One of them was the art critic at the Sydney Morning Herald, the main paper in Sydney. And he was just about the only person who got back to me. And he said, look, this is okay. It's nice of you to write to me. The stuff you've sent me is okay. So why don't we meet up? And he just helped me get my start. I mean, we went around the galleries together over the course of the next year or two. He was incredibly generous to me, and he helped me. At the time, he was doing 2 columns on art for the Sydney Morning Herald, and he was sort of keen to offload one of them, a kind of, a shorter column in the weekly going out guide, So he passed that off to me, and I spent the next few years just going around the galleries in Sydney, and writing a short column about shows that I saw, which was a wonderful way in.
So the bridge from art history to criticism?
It was a real bridge. Yeah. I mean, it's not the same thing in a way, is it? And I was walking around.
That's what I find fascinating in your work, because there's such a historic grounding in what you're writing about. But anyway,
right.
Go on.
Yeah. I mean, I'd sort of focused on 19th century French art. I would say mostly. I'd had an introductory course on modernism, and then sort of went back to 19th century and got into Manet and Morisot and the Impressionists and so on. So then to be walking around the galleries looking at contemporary art, it was interesting. I felt all at sea for a while. And I would say one thing about having this guy, John MacDonald, as my Virgil, if you like, sort of taking me around and guiding me through it all, was that, he was a really wonderful writer. He still is, a terrific critic. He had more conservative leanings, though. And, I think that had a big effect on me until I started to kick against it, I suppose. And that came both there in Australia and probably even more when I moved to London a few years later. And so now, you have to be a generalist. You have to sort of be able to write about old master painting one week or one day, and the latest video art the next day. And while I would say that my first love probably is painting and drawing and more traditional arts, there's no question that some of the best work made in the last 20, 30 years has been, for instance, video art, or, it's just come out of left field. It's come out of new media, and I'm completely open to it. I love it. And there's nothing better than discovering work in a kind of mode or in a medium that you hadn't expected to like, and then thinking, wow, that is actually incredible. And no wonder people are getting excited.
Yeah. I wonder about that generationally, how much, whether it's the older you are, the more resistant you can be to some of this stuff. Although, I know certain exceptions in the art world in that case among critics. But let me ask about, was Australia distant? Well, did it come out, or did it, I'll say, feel like, an outpost, or did you still feel like you were, in the world, in the artistic crux of things?
It's a fair question.
Or did it require coming to England?
Well, it does feel out on a limb in many ways, but there's an interesting aspect to that. First of all, there was kind of the example looming over anyone who was interested in writing about art in Australia in that time, which was the example of Robert Hughes,
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, who was, I met only once, wonderful man, and just incredible writer, incredible energy, life force, and obviously knowledge. So, he made being an art critic seem like an attractive thing to be. And had he not been there, setting that example, I'm not sure it would even have occurred to me, So, and he was an influence on this guy, John MacDonald, I mentioned as well. So, there's a kind of lineage. I think what's interesting about the art scene in Australia is that there's a whole history of artists who, responded to Australia and specifically the Australian landscape, which is so unique. And seeing and being aware of that story, of the story of artists who in many cases had come from Europe or a European outlook, figuring out how to represent this completely new landscape and how long that took and how the breakthroughs were just amazing breakthroughs. It's such a fascinating story. And these artists who made those breakthroughs are household names in Australia. And yet not a single one of them, I think, would be known to 99% of Americans, even in the art world.
My only knowledge comes from the song lines that Bruce Chatwood book, and I'm afraid to mention it for fear it's something that's like verboten.
No, not at all. I read that, and I loved it. And you're talking about specifically Aboriginal art, and that's been an amazing story over the last 30 or 40 years, and to the extent, because that's the interesting thing about what we think of as Aboriginal art, the painting that we think of as Aboriginal art really only dates back to the 1970s. The motifs and the way of looking at the world go back 40,000 years. But it was only when Aboriginal painters started painting in acrylics on canvas that this sort of new art form that's getting some, international exposure now came into being. It's interesting. One of the people who's really got into it lately is Steve Martin, and he's been collecting like crazy and discovering everything he can about it. It's been really moving and impressive to watch. He's so serious and dedicated, and he's been to Australia now, and he has a wonderful collection. He
is someone I'm secretly trying to angle towards
I'm sure,
getting on the show and not talk about the movies and the comedy, but just focus in on the art. But
well, he'd probably love that because he's so brilliant and eloquent on art. I went to interview him, not about Aboriginal art originally. We did that later, but when he had helped put on a show of the Canadian artist Lauren Harris, and Canadians have it's a similar sort of dynamic to Australian art. It's like these people are household names in Canada, and yet no one outside of the country seems to know of them. And there's that eagerness to sort of share that. So it's wonderful when someone like Steve Martin helps to facilitate that.
Yeah. How often do you discover someone, not in terms of, blowing them up for the world, but just that sense of, I had no idea this person was out there and they have this incredible body of work, and that sense of almost feeling like a latecomer happily because you're getting exposed to something new. But does that still strike?
I mean, it does. I feel like I discover people and they're still undiscovered. It's like you can exaggerate the sort of influence that you might have, and that goes for a lot of artists I know in Australia, some of whom are friends and some of whom are not, but I just know about them, and I would love their work to be better known internationally and think that it completely deserves to be. But it's not so easy for one voice to sort of do that. And of course, you have to find the right excuse to write about them. There's an artist called John Marinjal, who's an Aboriginal painter who works primarily on bark, and he's absolutely incredible. But he hasn't really had too many international shows. He's had a few, and I think there was a period in the 90s where he became big, and I think it's beginning to happen again. But I had to go back to Australia to see a show of his there at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, before I could write about him for the Washington Post.
Gotcha.
So yeah, you're dependent. I mean, it's the same for other critics like Peter Sheldal, I know you've spoken to. I mean, you're kind of writing at this stage about museum exhibitions. So once an artist has got a museum show, they're already pretty well known.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's that tension, I guess, in terms of, for where you're writing. You know, you're writing, in your case, for the Washington Post, previously Boston Globe, and, it's got to have that not just the, what's going on in a particular gallery for a week, as opposed to, something that's going to be there for the audience to see.
That's right, unfortunately. But I mean, there's still so many. I think of commercial galleries as kind of like the engine room of the art world. There are so many things to be discovered in them. And there's something about, I mean, you hear the word commercial and there's something pejorative there, but there's something I think about these dealers who are really they're gambling on someone. They have to have real faith in their own eye, their nous, their sense of, this is someone who could be important. And I think that's really impressive, and the curators, the museum directors and so on, they're looking at the commercial galleries all the time, and we need to as critics as well.
Now, it does raise the question, ever had thoughts of art on your own? Making art, I mean?
Well, I know that you have, and I've watched, and I'm so impressed. And I think that's just
my terrible doodles of Philip Roth yesterday. But anyway.
Saw that one. I thought that was terrific. I mean, it's wonderful. Look, I'm a writer essentially. I mean, that's the first point to make. I find writing hard enough, but I'm so much in awe of artists and even of people, who are just beginning, or people who, never going to have a museum show. I mean, just to be there in a studio or in a room or outside, it's the most amazing thing. I don't do much, but I remember in the early days of the pandemic, I pulled out a book of Matisse drawings, and I had like a lot of people, I had what I thought was COVID in those very early days. And it may have been, but I had an antibody test a few months later and it came up negative. So I have to assume I didn't. But I was definitely really sick. It might have just been bad flu, but because COVID was happening, I isolated.
Psychosomatically, we just assume.
Exactly. But I did a lot of drawings, sort of just copies of these Matisse drawings. And I found it so wonderful, just meditative and restful. And it just, to do anything like that, to visit artist studios, to ask dumb questions about what brushes they use, what paints they use, what kind of camera, all of that stuff I drink in and I love. It's such a wonderful opportunity to learn, and you get insights that you wouldn't otherwise.
Oh, yeah. There's a couple of guys I follow on Instagram because they post videos of just drawing and doing watercolors. And,
right.
I'm in awe. And simultaneously, I know it's a sped up video, that they're not doing this in real time. Mm-hmm. This is actually a really, really fast thing, but it's still that sense of they still did that, relatively quickly. They've got the eye, the hand. They've been doing this for decades. They know what they're doing. And I'm always, just a year into it, just kind of trying to figure out what I can do.
I mean, you must be discovering a lot as you go, and that's exciting. And it's funny. I think of when you talk about the speed, I always think, when I look at someone like Frans Hals or Manet, people talk about the looser the brushstrokes, and they seem to sort of, there's a kind of nonchalance behind these strokes that seem to capture effects of light or movement so deftly. And you almost imagine that they're sort of just knocking off a portrait in an hour or two with sort of, like Zorro, dash here, dash there, but you look at that stuff and it's incredibly exact. Same with John Singer Sargent, it's not something, it's more an illusion. It's this sort of idea of sprezzatura, isn't it? This illusion of ease. But in fact, the precision is still incredible, and any wrong stroke is going to spoil the effect. So it just leaves you more and more in awe, I think.
Yeah, it's. I think one of the great lessons I've learned is it's okay to screw up, because not wanting to screw up is what keeps you from doing anything or risking a single stroke. So
absolutely, yeah.
And Ed Sorel was one of my key lessons in go straight to ink. Don't worry about the pencils. You'll figure it out with the pen. You'll make it happen. And that's mentally something that freed me up with some of my drawings. It was just the yeah, it doesn't have to be exact. It has to be real. And, you try it from there.
And so are you still doing pencils? Because I saw you
it
had some
varies.
colored pencil stuff as well.
Yeah, there's some I've done. I very recently went back and started doing pencil drawings with the idea of either inking them or painting over, because I'd gotten a little too psychotic, we'll say, over drawing ink, etc., to the point of not getting anything done for days on end. So I had I'll loosen up a little. I'll sketch something out with pencil. I'll figure out what I can do from there. Now that the weather is better here, I can start going out, just sitting outside and drawing trees, as I started out doing a year plus ago.
Fantastic. And what about paint? I mean, have you tried that, or are you planning to?
It's been watercolor so far.
Yeah.
A pal of mine got me gouache. A neighbor who is a painting teacher sent me a set of oil paints. I'm like, no, that's way too much. At that point, I'll feel like I'm really committed. It's the same way with my coffee fixation, that if I started roasting my own beans, that would be the point at which I've gone too far.
Right.
And I think with painting, oil would be the, Gil, you've really pushed it, to the end.
Come on. I think you'll get there.
Well, that said, I when I was reading the Nikki de Saint Phal autobiography by Nicole Rudick a couple of weeks ago, I had this moment of, I could do sculpture and do some big metal stuff in the backyard, and realized, no, Gil, you would probably lose a limb. You can't do that. So,
right. Yeah, but there's nothing like art supply stores, is there? They're such incredible.
Oh, that was just yesterday. I was out running some errands. I thought, let me just stop at Blick, and $200 later, I'm like, now there's some new media for me to try out, and new size of papers and everything else, and I'll go from there. But
maybe you'll find your métier as a video artist eventually. I mean, it's one step after the other, right?
Yeah, that's the. I always joke, if I look good on screen, this is obviously not the job I would have. But that's the. I'll shoot other stuff and see what happens. But this is all about me prattling on, which, as you know, I'm good at. But let me ask you. You mentioned the kicking back on John MacDonald's conservatism in terms of finding your voice as a critic that way. Finding yourself as a writer, when did you feel you were actually, writing well, as opposed to, I can't believe they just paid me for this column?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I'm still, vulnerable to moments of feeling like a bit of a fraud. But I do feel like I'm less conscious when I sit down. I'm less conscious of influences, and probably have felt that for quite some time. But I think definitely early on, I had these models in my head. I couldn't help it, and some of them would be art critics. So there'd be Robert Hughes. There'd be definitely Peter Sheldal, who's just, I think, by far the most wonderful stylist, almost in any form of nonfiction, but certainly among art writers. And then just, I mean, I love fiction and nonfiction. It doesn't need to be about art. So I think some of my favorite writers are, the kind of writers who are not necessarily known for their style. So Alice Munro, or going further back, Chekhov. The kind of writers who just have an ability to say what they want to say, and they're incredibly deft, of course, with their words, but they're not drawing attention to that. And yet I think also with art writing, the one thing I really want to convey is a kind of energy, the energy of enthusiasm, because nothing's worse, I think, than reading newspaper reviews, which just feel dutiful, that feel sort of plodding and, village explainer kind of stuff, where you're just, you feel like you're taking medicine. So, and the only way to get across that kind of energy and enthusiasm is with a bit of sparkle, with a bit of style, with word choices that are occasionally arresting and so on. So, but for me, the kind of the feeling of truth that you get from writers like Munro and Chekhov, and people like Janet Malcolm. I think she's a writer I really admire. Helen Garner, the Australian writer. They're all people that I have, if not in my head as I'm writing, then definitely as part of the, what do you say, the mulch, the background music, whatever it is, the people who I care a lot about and would love to sort of feel like I'm beginning to approach anything like that.
And how's the field changed for you? I mean, you're old enough that you've, seen the transition to primarily online.
Yeah.
For how, how the writing gets disseminated or how newspapers work. What's that given and taken away, I guess?
There's things that have changed in two areas. One is in the art world and one is in journalism, and they're both enormous subjects. So I'll try to be really concise.
I realized I should have been clear. We'll start with the art criticism side of it,
right?
Your job as opposed to art and the art world.
So that's to do with just the nature of newspapers, and a lot of people know about this and have talked about it. It's pretty straightforward. It's just the move to online means that there's this competition for readers, and everything is measurable. Not just the number of people who click on an article, but the number of people who take out subscriptions after reading your article, the engagement time. All these things are being measured every second of every day, and you can check, how you're going in those terms anytime you like. I've just stopped because I think it's counterproductive. But
well, as I put it, the only numbers I care about now are my white blood cell count.
Yeah,
so really,
right, Gil, absolutely.
I stopped looking at web stats and everything else once that came through.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you didn't have anything as traumatic to
to
separate you.
That gives you a real perspective, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So journalism has changed because of that. And companies like the Washington Post pay very close attention to these metrics. They matter a great deal. And yet at the same time, they know that it's not the full story. And the fact that we have two Pulitzer Prize winning art critics. We've got a great art staff, other superb critics, and a budget to travel and so on. I mean, all of these things show that the Post has a sense of wider mission relating to the arts. And so it's a great place to work. I feel very lucky. I'm based in Boston, and my beat and my colleague Phil Kennicott's beat as well are both kind of national and even sometimes international. So, it's great to have that support. And I'm very conscious that that's a more and more kind of rare thing for newspapers to do. But you always feel, and I think this has always been the case, to be honest, it's not just with the advent of the internet, but you feel as an arts writer that your position is more precarious. It's not sure. Central to the mission of a great newspaper. But I think I would prefer to stay with a place like the Post than to be writing just for the art press, because there you really do feel like you're writing only to an in crowd. And I think, that brings with it all sorts of problems that I really admire people who work in the art press and in the academy, of course, and I'm dependent on their work a lot of the time. I mean, I'm in awe of them, but there's something about speaking to a wider readership that matters to me.
Well, along those lines, you just finished, I think it's finished, 102 Great Works in Focus for the Washington Post. I say finished because
finished, yeah.
That's the thing. It was supposed to be 100, and I noticed there's 102 at this point, so I figure it's still going. But talk about that project and the sort of feedback you've gotten from it, and what what the audience is, or what you want a reader or viewer to get from it. Yeah,
the basic idea is just that I take one work of art. It has to be in a public museum anywhere in America, and I just write 500-600 words about that. It comes out once a week. Occasionally I skip a week, but it's basically once a week. And, I try to have a wide variety of things, but it's all things that I love or I'm interested in. And I try not to make it sort of educational, going back to that point. I don't want to be edifying readers. I just want it to be a personal response. And obviously some facts are helpful and give people a bit of grip or a bit of an anchor. So I'll sketch in something about the work and the artist who made it. But these pieces are an attempt to be a kind of personal response. And it's an ongoing series. It comes out of something I did at the Boston Globe, where I was for 8 years. So I did 150 of them for them. And then that was called Frame by Frame, and we had to find a new name. I don't love great works in focus, but if you think of something better, let me know.
Listen, I'm the guy who came up with virtual memories back in the 90s when Windows was using that term,
right.
and I've never quite escaped it.
So, I like it. Yeah, you can get stuck with these things. That's true. But I
also came up with the very terrible URL of chimeraobscura.com. So I'm really not someone to consult for this.
I'm not sure. I think you might be. We can email about it later. But anyway, it's something that I love doing. So every time I go to a museum to review a show, I make sure that often I'm just taking photos with my phone, but I'm trying to think about paintings or sculptures, mostly paintings and photographs that I might write about for this Great Works in Focus column. And the response is, it's actually, it's been really amazing. And I was noticing that at the Boston Globe as well. But certainly I think people just want to read something that's short, but that is also personal and not necessarily tied to the news of the day, right? Because I plan these out weeks in advance, and it's almost always got nothing to do with the news of the day. And I think, for people who are drowning in, it was Trump news, wasn't it, for such a long time, and now it's Ukraine, whatever it is. These are the reasons that newspapers exist, but the idea that they might also exist to give people an opportunity to think about something else, I think is great. And, this is our incredible inheritance. America has really the best art museums in the world, and such an amazing array of them across the entire country. I've just been traveling the last few days from Cleveland to Toledo and then Chicago. And
I wasn't sure because you were posting images with those days. I wasn't sure if it was archive stuff of yours or if you're actually been on the road.
Yeah, no, I've been on the road, and I'd been to Cleveland and Chicago before, two of the best museums in the country, but not to Toledo. I'd heard about it for a long time, and its collection's amazing. It's incredible. This stuff exists. It's out there. These museums are incredible institutions. They're not beyond criticism, of course, but they really are an amazing thing that part of the civic fabric of this country, and they're places of pleasure and eros, right? You go in and it's like, where else can you see so many naked people? And we were in, it was fantastic. I was with my son, and we were in the museum at Toledo, and we saw an African-American couple, and the man got on his knees and proposed to his fiancée, or his girlfriend, in the Arms and Armor gallery. It was so hilarious. It was just beautiful. And I walked right past them at the very moment, not realizing. And then everyone started clapping, and it was gorgeous.
Wow. I think you answered this question at the beginning of your book, The Art of Rivalries. Farthest you've traveled to see a piece of art?
Yes, right. Well, it probably is that one. It was one of the paintings I focus on in a chapter of that book is a painting in Japan, where is it again? Fukuoka. And it's an obscure sort of modern museum, and it's a painting by Degas of Manet and his wife. But the curious thing about it is that the figure of Manet's wife, Suzanne, has been cut away. And we know from things that were written at the time and shortly afterwards that was done by Manet himself. And there's a mystery about why he would have done that to a really wonderful painting of himself and his wife by his friend at the time. And so I wanted to try and find out more about that. And that was a fun trek. I was actually in Japan. I made it coincide with a work trip, and that's often the way. That's
right? The amount of in the before time, the amount of podcasts that I got in because of business travel. Yeah,
I bet. Right.
Well, I do have the oddball Japan art connection story of my very last trip before the pandemic, February 2020. One of my clients was going to fly me and my wife to Japan for a week to visit a couple of different pharmaceutical companies and speak to a association. And, you got to bring gifts. So I want to get some New York oriented gifts. I picked up a couple of Keith Haring, bags with little holders, with Keith Haring designs on them, figuring it's a nice little thing. It shows New York. It's a giveaway thing. And we're going to visit one of the companies that's there. That's actually another one of my clients. And my guide who connects all this mentions that the CEO of the company is the largest collector of Keith Haring art in the world and has this huge collection of stuff in the US. And I'm
kidding.
God damn it, it's sitting in my hotel. Why didn't you tell me before this? So, I ended up telling his wife, who's an executive there, I said, can you send someone to the hotel? We're checking out today, but I wanted to put a package together. I have something for your husband. I didn't realize it was going to be absolutely perfect, but they sent someone to the hotel after we had checked out, picked the thing up, wrote me the most wonderful letter. But yeah, it was this moment of, I would not have expected this artist to be collected by this pharmaceutical executive in Japan, of all places. But
isn't that extraordinary? Yeah. And Keith Haring in Japan. It's funny. Are you someone who's sort of partial to Japanese aesthetics? I mean, I always find it interesting. I find I am. I know people who I think
so. And there was a piece that was given to me during that trip from another pharma company it's some sort of woodblock print of a swan that I've got sitting on my desk here, that I have a side writing desk that has no electronics on it at all. It's the analog desk, I call it, where I just sit down and hand write or draw. And I just look at that every morning. And, I think I've got some of that, especially once I started using a pocket brush for the first time. Literally, the second sketch I did of it was with a heron that came off looking like a Japanese calligraphy. And I thought, oh, okay, I get it. This is, this seems to be the tool for me for this moment. And it just, there's something about it that just really worked for me in terms of getting a line across.
That's interesting.
But yeah, I do appreciate the aesthetic. There are things that there are aspects of Japanese art that I think are just inherently, we're not going to make a connection as Western people.
Right.
But there are other aspects that, really, really groove, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I feel almost exactly the same way. I think that, the parts of it that you don't feel a connection with are almost
cultural, I want to say, or traditional in a way.
Definitely, there's a deep cultural difference, but there's something about registering that even that is kind of intoxicating. This feeling of, wow, this is something really different. Like it is. I can't just sort of live here for 20 years and sort of, acclimatize myself to it. It's just, it comes out of something much deeper. And you get these sort of Japanophiles. Is that the right word? I don't know.
It sounds good. Yeah.
who do, spend their entire life there immersing themselves in Japanese culture. People like Donald Ritchie. And it's fascinating and impressive, but you're still struck by, there is still just, this distance, this kind of, you're never going to quite be part of the culture. So, but there's a lot about it that I feel such a deep affinity for as well. So it's interesting. It's
you ever feel American?
I mean, that's a good question.
This is coming on the heels of my Rebecca Mead conversation, where she spent 30 years in America and moved back to UK for various reasons. So it's something that's been on my mind.
Yeah. I mean, I feel very Australian, that's for sure. But I've lived out of that country for a long time now. And, but first I lived in England. I had 4 years there. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't feel American, but I love this country and I love where I live. And, it's just interesting to be able to have that perspective on a country that you still live in. And it's awkward in some ways when things politically feel like they're falling apart, as I think they do. You feel almost guilty, I think, for sort of having that fallback position of, well, I'm really Australian, like I'm not responsible for any of this. But that's, of course, ridiculous and an illusion. So I think you have to, having lived here for such a long time and having kids who speak with American accents, you have to take responsibility for where you are and everything about it. And yet it is wonderful to also have a perspective, both from, the Australian point of view and from the British point of view. And I'm always amused at how sort of beguiled, one culture is by the other, even in these countries that are speaking the same language. And I think it affects, you see it in the art world. I mean, I think there are artists who are so famous and so beloved and so much part of the culture in Britain, for instance, who have never quite translated here in America. And I think of people like Francis Bacon, and going back to Turner even, and Constable. There's admiration for them. There's a sense with Turner of how he kind of helped lead into abstraction, which is sort of all important in post-war American art. But a kind of resistance. I mean, if you go back to the Turner show at the Met back in, 2009, 10, if you read all the reviews in the New York Times, the New Yorker, they're all like so critical of Turner. And I'm thinking, really, you're going to get stuck into Turner? I mean, it's interesting.
His ones with the Frick just have always annihilated me. But
it's great. I mean, people love him, but the critical consensus seemed to be against him, and that interested me. And I think Lucian Freud is another example. He's such a, who's born in Germany. He's such a British artist in so many ways. And there's why hasn't he translated quite as much here? It's interesting. I think people don't. Firstly, he's a figurative artist. Secondly, he doesn't make people look more beautiful, if anything, the opposite. And I think that goes against a certain sort of American idea of, I don't know, the body beautiful or self-improvement or something like that. And then maybe that's enough, those two things. I don't know. There's a lot of reason.
I was going to contrast this or compare it with the example I always like to use from my dumb world, Robbie Williams.
Oh, the pop star.
Yeah, huge everywhere in the world, never got over in America.
Yeah, right, and, exactly.
I mean, every European country I would visit, there would be a Robbie Williams tour going on. There'd be the posters of the albums and bus stops. And it's one of those, if you mentioned his name in America, no one will have any idea who you mean. And yet,
massive,
absolutely gigantic.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. When you, I remember driving through Europe, it was just Robbie Williams all the time on the radio.
And if you asked 50 people in your neighborhood, they'd say who? Yeah. Nobody would know who you were on about. But tell me about Lucian Freud. You were friends-ish?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was just 29. He was 70 something. So.
Well, as we know, the age thing. Well, never mind. I'm not going to get into that.
You like older people, absolutely. No, there's something about it.
Oh, I wasn't going to say me. I was thinking more Freud with the May December thing. But anyway,
okay. So I had seen a show of his work in Sydney years before I met him, and it made an enormous impression on me. And so when I moved to London, my fiance at the time, now my wife, had gone there to take violin lessons with a teacher at the Royal College of Music there. And so I followed her over and was working at the Art newspaper, a wonderful newspaper, sort of monthly thing that comes out there dedicated to all things in the art world. And it was sort of my first office job, really. And I found it very hard, and I kind of got bored easily. So I found a way to get a note to Lucian Freud, and I did. And he responded in a lovely way, sent a card, and explained that he'd read a review of his work that I'd written in the Sydney Morning Herald, and invited me and Joe to lunch. And it went from there, and went back to his studio. And over the next 3 or 4 years, either Joe and I, or more often just myself, would go to his house, his studio, or go out to a restaurant with him, probably once every 3 or 4 weeks, and just take weird middle of the night phone calls from him. And I was far from the only writer that he liked to talk to. Bill Fever, his biographer, was someone who spoke to every day. His biography is incredible. His 2-volume biographies has come out in the last year or so. And Martin Gayford, another critic in the UK, was someone he spoke to a lot and saw a lot. But yeah, you can imagine as a young critic who'd only just moved across from Australia, to be spending time with him was really extraordinary. And he is still by far the most interesting person I've ever met. And it was, I mean, I remember reading someone saying that being in his company was like sort of, sticking your fingers into an electrical socket or something like that, or, being plugged into the national grid, I think she said.
Yeah.
And it really was like that. I mean, he was, and it's not that he was incredibly extroverted. He wasn't, or exuberant. In many ways, he was quite shy, but a lot of shy people have that kind of secret theatricality, don't they? And he, if not theatricality, certainly had an amazing way of sort of commanding not so much the room, but the intimate space between two people. And it did sort of dislodge you from yourself a little bit. Certainly as a young man, I felt that effect, and I know a lot of other people have.
Now, with the Art of Rivalry, which I mentioned earlier, you have 4 chapters of 2 pairs of artists who were, we'll say, influential. I mean, you kind of blow up the notion of rivalry within the process of the book, but Freud and Bacon are the most recent of the pairs that you have in the book. Does that notion of rivalry still exist nowadays, or do you think they were sort of the last major sort of bipole of artists who were feeding off of each other, as it were?
I think it still exists very much. Yeah, I mean, in any field where people are ambitious, it's going to exist. But yeah, I just found that the idea of rivalry was more complicated, and often it was very much connected to not just influence, but kind of this mercurial, complicated kind of love. And often there were just situations where you had incredibly close relationships, often where one figure was ahead of the other in terms of how advanced their art making was, and the junior figure, if you like, sort of falling under their spell to some degree. And I think that's just a subject that interests me enormously anyway. I feel it relates to my own life, and, a lot of the literature I love, like this idea of falling under the spell of people. Probably my favorite novel is Augie March, The Adventures of Augie March by Bellow. And he's just constantly, falling under the spell of mentors, right? Moving from one to the other. And it always unravels in some degree. And I think that was the case in these artistic relationships that I described. In different ways, each of these very intimate relationships unraveled. And it's a natural kind of unraveling. It comes when you realize, no, you're not, you're more than just a protege. You have to find your own way. And that involves a certain kind of kicking out against the person who influenced you. So I think it exists everywhere, and it's always going to exist. And of course, yeah, there are more recent examples of it. I actually wanted to, instead, the Matisse-Picasso relationship is always so fascinating, especially.
I was just going to cite that one in particular,
right,
of the 4 pairs that you use. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because I almost jettisoned that. I wanted to replace them either with the relationship between Cy Twombly and Robert Rauschenberg, or the one between Sigmar Polke and Gerhard Richter. But my publisher wanted me to stick with that. And in many ways, I'm glad, because that is, obviously it's such a famous relationship. It's not clear how close they were as friends, but they were certainly friendly in various ways. But it went more spectacularly bad for a period there than some of the others.
Yeah. And it puts me in mind almost, you have Picasso as Picasso. I think of the end of that Coen Brothers film, Inside Llewyn Davis, where you get everything that this character is going through and the various influences and fights that he's having. And at the very end, Bob Dylan shows up on stage and you realize everything he's gone through is for nothing. Yeah, there's going to be this thing coming that just, changes the entire world in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's that sense of, as you were saying, art history and art criticism, and seeing how what the trends mean, I guess, and what that influence is like, not just between 2 artists, but, all those subsequent generations as we see it.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. I'm interested in that more intimate side of art history. That's that's not about the big movements and how they reflect society at large. I mean, all that's interesting, of course. But there's something about, imagining yourself in the studio and thinking about, I mean, I always think this with musicians and composers, but even improvisers, if you sit and listen to jazz, if you listen to even an album that's so sort of, etched into everyone's mind as kind of blue, and played at every cafe and every restaurant, you've heard those notes again and again and again. But it is just so incredible. And I think you become aware of that as you think to yourself, what if you try and imagine yourself into the musician's mind and think, what notes would I play next? What run would I perform here? What transition would I make? I mean, to try, and it's of course completely beyond me, but to try at least to imagine yourself into that state of mind can only increase your awe of what's achieved. And a lot of this stuff is done under enormous psychic pressure. And I think we ignore that by using lazy terms like genius or just the cliche of, oh, there's Picasso with his, in his big Y-front underpants, or his ridiculous love life, which was so ugly in so many ways. But the pressure under which he created some of his works, some of the breakthrough works, is astonishing, and
I think
kind
the word
of suffering. Work, exactly. It is work.
That's exactly, because especially when you mention the musical side, and I think I mentioned this in my friend interviewing me at the end of last year episode.
Yeah,
there was a demo by Elvis Costello that I listened to once and thought, oh, this is where he was going, but it's nowhere near as good as what the final thing was. And it's just that sense of that final thing was not, Athena jumping out of Zeus's head. This all requires work, and especially when it's a collaborative thing like the music or other spaces like that.
No, I heard you talk about that, and I think when you think of the Beatles and everyone's been talking about Get Back, the documentary recently.
Yeah.
What a privilege, right, to be there, watching that taking place. I mean, and one of the things I was struck by, I've been writing about Yoko Ono this last week for the newspaper, and that's a fascinating subject in itself, because she was a really interesting artist, and a lot of people just forget that as they sort of fall back on these ideas of, a woman who broke up the Beatles, and almost with these sort of racist overtones as well, I think. But, that's another subject. But the relationship there between Paul and John, to me, is astonishing, because they loved each other. I mean, we have this narrative that it was all breaking up and this was the final, but the looks that they give each other as they're trying to tune into each other and pick up on what the other is doing, and the humor that exists the whole time. Wow. I mean, I really felt that they loved each other so deeply, and that's probably what made the breakup so difficult, right? But it's such an intimate thing to be creating collaboratively like that.
Right. It reminds me, it was, I think, Chuck Klosterman who said, there's not going to be another band that 50 years later we're still, parsing, things like that, like the looks between these guys and, everything they did. And, these guys just had, it's not just a media creation, it's that whole gestalt and everything they made.
Yeah.
But Yoko puts me in mind, balancing, amplifying underrepresented demographics, B, the great works in focus, and whether you work to, make sure it's not too many dead white men in a row when you're doing that, which is part of my podcast thing, where I always have to realize, oh, you've interviewed 12 guys in a row, Gil. You need to move around a little. And third, and this is, a giant non-question, Bertha Morisot and female artists in general, and what you're doing with her relation with Manet.
Yeah, well, I mean, to start with the first
Talk about women in art.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm very conscious that the artists in the Art of Rivalry were all male, and I defend that in my own mind, because I think there's something about the nature of these male relationships that really fascinated me, and there weren't examples. They were very. Each relationship had a very specific dynamic, and I won't go into it because it's boring. But it mattered to me that it was those artists. There's a great book that came out in the meantime called Ninth Street Women,
Oh yeah, that comes up as a recommendation because I had to get your book on the Kindle because it was back ordered in print, and that was the first thing it was recommending that I read.
Yeah, right. It's
Also,
by
in addition to Art of
Mary
Rivalry.
Gabriel. It's a wonderful book, and it's about the milieu of artists, female artists specifically, in the sort of Second World War and post-war years. People like Lee Krasner, Joan Mitchell, Grace Hardigan, a whole bunch of them who are all among my favorite artists. They're great artists, and her book's superb. In terms of my great works in focusing, I mean, yeah, I write about women artists in that all the time. Probably I would say 1 in 4 or 5 are female artists. I would like 95% of the works that you see in our museums, unfortunately, are male artists.
Right.
So, but I'm trying to rebalance that to a degree, and I'm not doing it out of a sense of duty or anything. I mean, these are works that I love and want to write about. And then you mentioned about Morisot and the book that I'm working on at the moment. It's basically about the relationship between Berthe Morisot, who was one of the great female impressionist painters, one of the great impressionist painters, but she was the only woman who was in all but one of the famous 8 impressionist exhibitions beginning in 1874. And she was just a great artist. And she isn't nearly well enough known, but you can find her works in most, of the great museums in America and in France and elsewhere. And she was very close to Manet. He did a series of portraits of her that are very famous. But what they both experienced together, and this is the subject of my book, is the siege of Paris and the Commune that happened the following year. So we're talking 1870, 71. A lot of listeners will know about this, but it's always surprising to me how few people know actually what went on there. So, I guess it's overshadowed, of course, by the First and Second World Wars. But I think you can't understand those conflicts without understanding what happened in 1870, 71, which is basically France declared war on Prussia. Prussia was sort of prepared for this and almost wanting it, perhaps. And they completely crushed France and laid siege to Paris. And the siege lasted more than 4 months. It was a brutal winter. And Manet, most of the Impressionists were out of Paris, but Morisot chose to stay with her family, and Manet and Degas as well chose to stay, and they joined up with the National Guard who were trying to defend the city. And what they went through, and people just don't realize this, and I think it's, connected to just the idea we have of Impressionism as this wonderful, art of pleasure and sunlight and Paris and its surrounds. But it was incredibly traumatic. And, this was one of the first times, and we think about this now with Ukraine, of course, but this was one of the first times, in modern history the first time where there was a deliberate campaign of bombarding civilian targets towards the end of the siege. But before that, they were reduced to eating pigeons and rats and all the zoo animals were killed famously. It's an incredible story. And we have the letters of Berthe Morisot that she wrote to her sister who had begun as an artist along with Berthe, a very good artist, and to her mother as well. And so there's this whole dynamic of, this is the beginning of her career and the question of should she pursue art as a career or not is looming in her mind all the while that she's suffering through this. And I think there's an enormous, when you know the impediments that she faced, it only increases the admiration you feel for the heroism she showed in choosing to pursue, not only to pursue art, but to show with the Impressionists against the advice of everyone, because they were very much seen as not to be taken seriously back then in 1874. And yet she chose to join up with them. Even Manet was saying, don't do it. It'll destroy your reputation. He famously never joined the Impressionist group, even though he was the biggest influence on them. He continued to show at the big salon. So yeah, that's the story I'm trying to tell. And already you can tell I'm letting it slip away from me. I'm just blathering on, but that's the idea.
That's always the usually when I'm recording with somebody who has a new book out, that's the worst question I could possibly ask is, what are you working on next? But at least here there's a gap between your last full-length book and this, so I feel like
too big a gap, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, you've been writing the entire time and producing. And in fact, I'm going to ask you later about a piece of writing you made in the last couple of years, so we can get away a bit from art into that. But before that, it's terrible to ask favorite artist or artwork, but favorite museum?
Favorite museum would be, I don't mind being asked favorite artist, by the way. But favorite museum, I mean, look, there's always this sort of tension, isn't there, between the big encyclopedic museums and then these intimate small museums that America is rich in. I think of the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in my hometown of Boston, but also a more modern version of that, the Kimball in Fort Worth. It's an incredible museum. Every work in there is a masterpiece. And the building itself, designed by Louis Kahn, is one of my favorites. And, the Phillips collection, for instance, in DC. So these smaller museums are always a treat. And I think, the general public seems to love them the most as well, because there's something about the bigger encyclopedic museums that can be a little daunting. But having said that, for me, I always think of the Met as pretty much the greatest museum in the world, even more than the Louvre for me. I mean, I know that's ridiculous because the Louvre is so great. But there's something about, the Met has modern work as well. So it has something that the Louvre doesn't.
Secretly, I enjoyed Orsay more than the Louvre.
Yeah, that's right.
Trips, but,
that's a great museum as well, of course. So, and then the Prado, just because, the Velázquez's, the Titians, the Goyas, that is one of my all-time favorites as well. But
and Bosch,
and the Bosch, the great Bosch, exactly. It's incredible.
Because the Prado was one of my downgrade ones, because I went into it with Met expectations and walked around like, yeah, it's okay. And then in retrospect, I'm like, no, actually, the things they had were really, really amazing in terms, especially the Goyas. But yeah, and those Velázquez. But
you can't go wrong, really. Absolutely.
Yeah. So in that case, favorite artist, favorite artwork?
Well, look, it's funny. I'm just on a high, having been to these 3 museums in the last few days. And it's always fun to see the artists who appear in each museum and think, oh, I didn't realize they had that. There's a Velázquez in each of those 3 museums, which is pretty amazing. But yeah, I think for me, it's Matisse and Manet. Those 2 are probably the ones that I feel such a deep kind of love for. And Matisse moves me just to think about his life in a way that almost there's probably no other artist who sort of gets me in the same way, because you think about it. He lived through 2 world wars and enormous drama and traumatic things happening to his family and to him. And I think people don't register that because they just think of sensuality and ease and relaxation, all those things that he famously stood for. But, the pressure behind all these breakthroughs that he made, we talked about that with Picasso before, but it's so strongly there in him. He had these panic attacks and sort of, unprovoked nosebleeds and trembling and, all these sorts of things that came purely out of the pressure he felt as he was doing things that he knew the rest of the world would think were mad, completely mad. And yet he needed to go through that to make these breakthroughs that he did make. Above all, the effect of saturated color. Cézanne said something similar to this, but it was only Matisse who really pushed it into making it manifest. The idea that, 1 square meter of blue is more blue than 1 square centimeter of blue, or you can translate that to feet and inches if you like. But the idea that the amount of a color is going to increase the effect of that color, and that seems obvious, but it's such a rebuke to Impressionism or Pointillism, which is constantly breaking color up into smaller and smaller units. And the influence that had on the 20th century is just immense, absolutely immense. And for me, color is more, I don't know, of the essence, perhaps, than line in 20th century art. But that's also a dumb thing to say, because the two are completely related, and you don't need to choose one over the other. But I think color does speak to me a little bit more.
First place you wanted to go to see art after the lockdowns?
I was at the Met on the day it reopened, so I guess that has to be
that
the
would
answer.
Do it.
Yeah, it was amazing. The joy on people's faces. It's still,
which you couldn't see because we're all wearing masks.
Well, true enough.
Yeah, I know. You see the crinkle around the eyes.
Exactly. It still makes me almost teary to think about, because there was just so much emotion there, and when you knew all the effort that had gone into shows that had to be cancelled as well, and when you knew how isolated people had been. I spoke to a lot of people for a piece I did for the Washington Post about that reopening, and it meant all these different things to different people, but it was so moving.
This coming week, I have 20 in-person meetings Monday through Wednesday in New York City and in Midtown. Thursday, I only have one meeting, and I thought,
that's got to be the day then.
That's my thought. I'm like, I'll finish that one at 12:30. I'll be in the East 50s. I'm either going to the Met or I'm going to the relocated Frick.
Yeah, at the old Whitney. That's wonderful. Yeah, but you might be wiped out from your 20 meetings the day before.
Oh, I will be. That's my thing. I'm staying in hotels or staying with friends for the nights that I'm in the city, but I'm going home Wednesday night once the last one's done, and then I'll come back in Thursday and I hope be a little more refreshed. Perfect. But I have that idea of no one is going to begrudge me if I just spend the afternoon looking at art. Absolutely. And as long as I don't end up with COVID, I'll feel better about it.
Yeah. I'm sure you'll be fine. And I mean, that's one of the things that I love most about art. I love all the different art forms, but the freedom that you have, you walk into these big buildings with lots of space and air, and no one's forcing you to stay in your seat or, wait for the intermission. You can go and get something to eat whenever you like. You can go to the bathroom. You can just walk out, and there's a freedom attached to it that I love.
I'll tell you, I went to the Jasper Johns at the Whitney a couple of months ago after finishing a podcast, because that is, of course, the motive force of my life. and I started backwards by accident. Mm-hmm. You walk in and it's a big wall of his work, and you can either go left or right from there. And I didn't realize left was going to be essentially chronologically the beginning. Mm-hmm. So I just happened to go right and realize these were things from the 2000s. And I thought, I'm going to lean into this.
Absolutely.
I'm going to follow Jasper Johns backwards in time and see, how I'm going to see the end result before I get to the flag and the footprint.
The targets. I'm sure he would have approved. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
And that's precisely my point. It's got a lot of freedom. There's a great essay by Theodore Adorno called the Valerie Proust Museum, and I've reread it so many times, and I still don't quite understand.
Did it make any sense? Yeah, because it's Adorno, so it's not going to make any sense.
That's always the problem, isn't it? But he basically contrasts these two views of artworks in museums. Paul Valerie's view is very critical of museums. He says that hanging all these works of art beside one another, it kind of reduces them to commodities, or it's like a meat market or a bazaar. And it's such a betrayal of the spirit in which they were made. He had a real modernist sense of the integrity and inviolability of the individual artwork. And I get that. I think that's a powerful argument. This idea that we should never reduce art to something instrumental, if you like. Yeah. But Proust's idea, of course, is the opposite. He goes to a museum and he loves that, you bounce into a Greek sculpture here, or hopefully not literally, and then an impressionist painter there, and then you smell someone's perfume, and then you look at the person who is walking by, and then you notice the sun coming in the window. And for him, and of course you feel this in Remembrance of Things Past or any of the other things he wrote, it was all mulch. It was all to be instrumentalized for his own subjective experience. And he turned that into something so profound. So, but Adorno, he brings his sort of Marxist Mandarin point of view to all this, but it's actually a wonderful essay. I really recommend it.
I'll have to give it a look. Given that I can, well, I could pretend I understand these things because I went to college a little bit older than you, so I was there during the heyday of the crazy deconstruction.
No, I was too. I think we're probably around the same age. I had all that postmodern stuff, all the French theorists and so on. But anyway,
and I'm glad you don't, dive into that with your criticism. But piece of artwork you've never seen in person that you're really dying to see?
That's a great question. I think I would have to answer the Ghent Altarpiece. Van Eyck's Ghent Altarpiece in Ghent, of course. So I've never managed to get there for some reason, but there's probably plenty of others that aren't springing to mind immediately.
Yeah, but the fact that one did right off the bat, that's probably a sign that it's the big one.
Yeah, so. I mean, it's a great work. And I think those Northern Renaissance artists are still, underrated and misunderstood, including by me.
Okay, here's the point where Sebastian's computer froze. Like I said, we had a few minutes of panic. He got back online. We downloaded the audio file and got restarted right here. I mean, I could have edited this so you wouldn't even notice, but here we go. After that unscheduled break, we may as well dive into something nice and easy. Philip Gustin and the whole problematic art thing.
Yeah, I mean, that was a difficult moment when the National Gallery, which had organized a Philip Gustin exhibition with 3 other leading museums, one in the UK, the Tate, and 2 others here, the MFA Boston and the MFA Houston. This was, I guess, 6 months after George Floyd. But Philip Gustin, he's a complicated artist, but he's one of the most famous post-war American artists. He started out his career making work that was leftist, and he made murals, and he made works that were explicit critiques of racism and the Ku Klux Klan and so on. He then turned to abstraction. He'd been close to Jackson Pollock, and he became a well-known abstract painter. But then, sort of feeling the pressure of world events and politics encroaching on his own psyche, and feeling like abstraction no longer was adequate for what he wanted to express, he turned back to making figurative art. And for a while, he famously used these kind of clunky, risible figures who had, heads in the shape of sort of Klan hoods. And they were part of his own sort of private theater of absurdity, and they represented aspects of his own inner life as well as things that were going on in the outside world, brutality and war and Vietnam and civil rights and all these things. But he was explicitly against racism. Everyone knows that. So for me to shut down that exhibition of this very important artist who's been enormously influential on contemporary artists, including African-American artists, people like Mark Bradford and Glenn Ligon and others, was just, to me, a bizarre case of self-censorship and a really terrible mistake. And I know people of good faith, people I really admire and respect and like, felt differently. But I was struck by the fact that so many artists felt that it was a mistake. And I felt like the reasons given by the museums weren't cogent or clear. And I just felt too that, the left sometimes does this. I mean, it was a decision made, on principles that I guess you associate with the left. But I feel like this kind of self-censoring is one of the worst kinds of mistakes that the left can make. If it's a political fight against, the other side, this just makes them an even easier target. It's cutting down on the values of free speech and free expression. We know that those aren't absolute values. This is a very contentious topic. I get it. But to have an artist like Gustin censored by museums who had thought him previously to be important enough to be the subject of this traveling retrospective going to 4 major institutions, wow, what a call. It just seemed like a mistake. And so, yeah, I had to write about it in the Post, and I ended up writing, 3 or 4 pieces critical of the decision. But anyway, they've put the show on. They're putting it on. It's going to open in Boston now in a month or 2.
Yeah, did you see it in New York? By all coincidence, I bumped into it in October in New York, and
I don't think it has opened yet. It's opening in Boston, so you might have seen.
I mean, they did a smaller one. They did the quote unquote controversial paintings a gallery put on in a.
Oh, that would have been Hauser and Wirth. Yeah.
Yes. I was trying to remember the name.
Right.
So thank you.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. They're his sort of dealer, and they were able to put on that show. I didn't see it actually. What did you think?
A friend of mine is a huge Gustin freak. I know the work in passing, and I just stood there like transfixed by some of especially the ones they were sort of positioning for that very reason. I looked around and thought, oh, okay, I get why on the surface people can get, flustered and freaked out by this stuff, but this is amazing, amazing work. And I think the first real art show I'd gone to since starting to draw, and it was just it was the first time I'd ever started just looking in a different way, I guess.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and I mean, Gustin's connected to that lineage of artists that I think you have a connection to, illustrators and cartoonists, and in fact, Chris Ware, I think, who's been one of your guests, wrote in the catalog, as did Art Spiegelman, and all these people think about Gustin and the influence that the comics had on him. Philip Roth was a friend of his. He's just such an interesting figure, and I was really looking forward to the chance for us all to be thinking about that at that time. When Trump was still in power, this was just ahead of the January 6th riots, and I can't imagine anything more powerful than having that show on in the National Gallery at that time. But, I get that it would have made people nervous as well. So, I have a lot of sympathy for any leaders of any institutions, to be honest. I really do. I mean, my dad was a school principal, right? And I just know it's not easy to be a leader. And especially over these last few years, it's been incredibly difficult. So I have enormous sympathy, but I did feel that it was very important to express, my opinion that this was a bad mistake.
If you could curate one show, Morisot?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be a show of Berthe Morisot and Edouard Manet. I think that would be an amazing show. But another thing that I have in my mind is, I mean, with Morisot, I mean, one of the things that she did and took further than any of the Impressionists was the loose brushstroke. I mean, we associate the loose brushstroke with Impressionism generally and with Manet, but she took it to a real extreme. She left parts of the canvas bare. There's a real sort of sense of flickering life, of transience, of evanescence that you get more from her than any of the other Impressionists. And I think, in my mind, that was a response to her experience through the siege of Paris and the Commune, this sense of how fleeting life can be, how transient it is. And she was incredibly bold, even radical in how far she took that, I think. So that would be an interesting pairing. But another show that I would like to see and maybe be involved in even, if I could, would be an exhibition of Lucien Freud's images of children. He did a lot of paintings and drawings of children, and you associate his art with making people look older than they really are, and making them look uglier than they are. And I get that, but I don't think he was trying to do that. I think he was trying to get a more and more powerful sense of the visceral presence. What is it like to occupy a body, and what I think you see in his pictures of children is a kind of, and sounds crazy because he was not a good father, at all.
But a prolific one. So, I'm sorry. Go.
Yeah, he was a prolific father. It's not fair to say he was not a good father, and I apologize to his children who dearly loved him in saying that. But he had relationships with some of them and not with others. And, for a lot of the rest of us human beings, that's pretty dismaying. But, he's got a number of children that he stayed very, very close to, many of whom are incredibly creative in their own ways, novelists, fashion designers, and so on, poets. But yeah, there is, I find, in his paintings and drawings of children a real tenderness, and it humanizes him for those who have an image of him as a rather pitiless and ruthless kind of objectifier of the human figure. So yeah, that's a show I'd love to see.
Indeed. Now, the other piece of your writing that I checked out last night and this morning, which I found incredibly moving, you had a piece called Net Loss, right, in a quarterly in Australia in 2018, which raises the question, since we're near the end of the conversation, we can go with something easy. Is there an inner self?
Something easy, right?
I could have started you off with that one too, but I thought
thank you, Gil, for not doing that. Look, I'm no philosopher, and so I'm ill-equipped to deal with those questions. Maybe it's not a philosophical question. Maybe it's more a scientific one. It's obviously stumped people for many, many centuries. That essay was a sort of extended and pretty incoherent riff on this idea of inner life in the digital age. I guess with the feeling that in this age of social media and, online existence, so much of the forces behind these new modes of relating are about externalizing ourselves, presenting a version of ourselves to others. And there's a feeling that, that people have always done that, but with this sense that there is this bifurcation. There is still an inner life, but you might present differently, whether it's socially or putting on a mask, dressing up, or online, but there's still an inner life against that. What I feel we're going through now is this sort of period where, wow, the very notion of an inner life might be disappearing. As we all externalize everything all the time. Well, not we all, but you do feel that that's a tendency.
No. Yeah.
So, it was a chance for me to turn back to some of my favorite artworks and also some of my favorite writings. Chekhov and Munro, I mentioned them. Alice Munro, I end up quoting her a fair bit, I think, and trying to.
And you bring in Philip Roth, my non-relative, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. He's great on this subject. So is Saul Bellow, and Rachel Cusk, whose recent trilogy.
I haven't read, and I've heard such great things about.
It's the best thing I've read in the last 5 years. Honestly, it stayed with me more than anything in the last 5 years. And it's funny because I've tried to read back into her earlier novels, and I'm not the biggest fan, to be honest. There's something about the form, the structure, and the content of the outline trilogy, as it's called.
Are you a completist with authors? Do you do that with other writers?
No, because I'm too slow. I mean, I try to be, and I feel like I've read almost every Chekhov story or almost every Alice Munro story, almost everything by Bellow, not everything by Roth, but a lot. But yeah, I'm just too, if I did that, I'd just be reading one author for like 2 years.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's what that essay was, a chance to complicate again the idea of inner life, to remind us all what it's about. It's not simple, and it's not inherently good even, like there are aspects of our inner selves that can be incredibly ugly. And we shouldn't sentimentalize it. And in the same way, there's a lot about, and you've talked about this, I know, Gil, but there's a lot about the world of social media and the the dopamine rush of clicks and all that. There's a good side to that. There is this, I think, Zuckerberg is full of crap, but the idea that Facebook and other social media apps provide a chance for people to connect who might otherwise not be able to is true.
Well, I mean, that's how you and I
exactly
we met through Twitter.
Exactly.
There are positives, but you have to pursue them / moderate them.
Exactly.
I mean,
and be aware
my joke
of the
is,
downside. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you going to go full Jerry Saltz on Instagram and Twitter? My hope, not.
Yeah,
but still,
Jerry's great, and he's very funny to his credit, so he keeps things lively. But yeah, you can definitely go down that rabbit hole, and I think it's I still find myself needing to sort of actively resist it, and when you've got kids as I do, they're teenagers, and it's such a cliched complaint amongst parents right now, but it's like how do you sort of not control or police, but just somehow negotiate this? It's incredibly hard. And some of, there are things about one's worldview one has to sort of change to some degree, but then you have to think about what are the things that you do want to hold on to, and that you think are important. So yeah, these are boring sorts of things, but yeah, this
is the stuff I find fascinating in that respect. It's that question of how many of those things are qualitatively different than what previous generations dealt with, and how much are just amplifications of, the young versus the old.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a shift in consciousness through technology and social media that is not, is not simply replicating things that we have gone through before when the telephone was created and trains began running and
exactly.
movable print, etc.
Yeah. No, I've done a lot of, like a lot of people, I've done a lot of thinking about this, reading about it, listening to podcasts, that New York Times podcast, The Rabbit Hole, in fact, is a great one. It's a really great podcast about this. It's a few years old now, but incredibly perceptive and incredibly worrying. So yeah, you think about all these things, but yeah, then you come back to how do I want to reclaim agency in my life? And one of the things, that matters to me, obviously, is looking at art. And I think, there is this tendency with everything existing online now to think of images, as infinitely reproducible. Yeah. And, I can tweet images from these museums I've just been taking photos in and so on. But to actually be at the museum and to have this space between you and this physical thing, this canvas that's maybe hundreds of years old, it's got paint on it, it's got a frame. There's something about, there's a charge that happens between you, in the distance between you. It's like an electrical charge between you and the object that simply doesn't exist in this frictionless world of online image reproducing. So, and is there inherent value in that? For me, yes. I mean, it's me in my body, surrounded by air, with certain smells, with certain memories from just a few moments ago, connecting to something that is, as I say, maybe hundreds of years old and is doing its own thing that is so specific to itself. And, I think you can get all nostalgic and dewy-eyed about some aspects of it, say, the artist's hand touched this thing, Van Gogh's hand. And, I've got not that much time for that way of thinking, but there is something about the connection between your own subjectivity and the object in front of you that is, it can be electrifying. And I just want that in my life. It matters a lot to me, but so does being outside and just walking through the streets or climbing a hill or lying down under a tree, all these things. I mean, they're all incredibly important. And, I think art is going to thrive in the future, as opposed to, the opinion of some people who think that it's all going to be NFTs and digital art and so on, precisely because people need it as a kind of antidote to the amount of time they're spending staring at screens.
And soon we can do it all in the metaverse.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding. Last question. Who are you reading?
Right now I'm reading Huckleberry Finn, rereading, I should say. I just finished reading Zadie Smith, her wonderful book that's sort of a take on Howard's End by E.M. Forster, another writer I love. And my son put me onto the Zadie Smith, and I've read a lot of her short stories and nonfiction, but I haven't even read White Teeth. So it was a discovery. I loved that book. It's called On Beauty. And then I just switched for this trip to Huck Finn, and it's so great. It's just incredible. It's been like
I
since
literally
childhood.
have no idea how non-Americans read that book.
Yeah,
not like how can you possibly read it, but what are you seeing in it versus what we see
it's
as
a great
Americans?
question. I mean, I don't have the perspective to be able to answer it, but I just love it. And I think a lot about Augie March. I mean, it's got a lot of, not just the title, The Adventures of Augie March and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but it's just got a similar kind of spirit of self-invention, making it on your own, bouncing from one situation to the other, that I find incredibly moving. And it's just such a well-told story. And yeah, of course, there's all sorts of stuff there to unpack with race and with class and everything, of course. But and that's all in my mind as I'm reading it, and I'm, it matters, but I'm also just loving it as a piece of narrative. Wow. It's just got so much energy.
Anybody looking for a plot will be shot.
Yes, right, which I love as well. I'm not a big plot person. I find it really hard following the plots of movies, for instance. I just can't. And if I watch it with family, I'm always having to sort of pause and say, hang on, can you just catch me up on this? Yeah, like, what's going on? I'm not a plot person. And maybe that's why I love Rachel Cusk for that reason in a way. It's not a plot. That trilogy are not about plot. Same with Knausgaard. It was actually Peter Sheldal who put me on to reading Knausgaard's My Struggle. And he was raving about it, and I picked it up, and I felt the same way. I just felt really, really affected by it. And, it's a very male version of the same sort of autobiographical impulse. But it's so convincing, and the level of sort of self-exposure, the humility, I think, there to expose so much vulnerability, it's profound, and it's completely plotless.
This is the thing that kills me. You guys keep turning me on to like gigantic pieces of literature that people I'm probably not going to record with, and so much of my reading is spent around that stuff.
I can only imagine. Yeah, it must be. Thank you for taking the time to read some of the stuff I've written. Again,
your stuff's a joy. And when you were talking about developing that prose style and that I'll say clarity, not that window pane Orwell line, but yeah, that sort of, that prose that gets across what you're trying to get across without having to dive into Baroque style or be Adorno-like in terms of jargon.
Well, part of it is that none of that, of course, would fly in a newspaper. You wouldn't be allowed.
No.
But it's nice as well to feel like you've still got room within the newspaper format to sort of develop your own voice. They do want and encourage that. But definitely, if I try to use a word that is not such a common word, or at least has a level of pretension or something to it, then my editors are going to be asking questions. But I love that. I always think, look, you can look it up. If you don't know, you can look it up. There's nothing wrong with, I think Peter Sheldal is a great example of that. He'll often use words. I remember him using the word bosky to describe a Cézanne landscape, blue-green boskiness or something like that. And I just thought, God, that is perfect. And any editor who wanted to cut that out should be dismissed. I mean, we have this incredible language. We may as well use it. And as I say, it's so easy to look things up if you're not sure. But what you don't want is to sort of have to convey pretension and sort of insider baseball kind of stuff.
Yeah. Willful obscurantism.
Exactly.
Or being deliberately obfuscatory, as I like to say. But.
That's a great word too, obfuscatory. Thank you.
But Sebastian, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a blast, even with little technical hiccup in the middle of it all.
I'm sorry about that. No, it's been a real joy. Thank you so much, Gil.
My whole thing is I want to make sure we actually get together when you're going to be in New York in future. I get to just like watch you in a museum looking at something.
Oh, I want to get together and watch you drawing. I mean, that's
we'll make it a date.
We can do that. We can do that.
I'll put it together and we'll.
But do keep going with that. And I think you're inspiring me. I'm gonna try and get back to a little bit of
just
drawing.
Look at a tree and start drawing it. As I joke, if you look at the very first ones, it literally looks like a guy with traumatic brain injury figuring out how to hold a pencil again. And within 3 weeks, it's like, oh, that's actually a tree with shading and bark and everything. So, yeah.
Do you know that book, The Elements of Drawing by John Ruskin? It was like
The joke is I've never read anything or taken any class, which should be relatively obvious from looking at my stuff, but now I'm going to write that one down.
No, well, it's just because it was like a drawing manual all through the 19th century. John Ruskin, right? Most influential sort of, everything, but certainly art critic. And it's, he just starts with, and I did this with some friends years ago, tried to follow the advice he gave, just, draw a square and shade it evenly using cross-hatching. And then, move to and I think drawing a tree or a small section of a tree was pretty much the next thing. So it's very simple, very straightforward. And it's all about that kind of attentiveness.
Out where I live, that is all I see. It's just trees. The window I'm looking out right now is just a bunch of trees and a big rock. And I really don't like drawing rocks. So, I'll get on with more trees. And the crocuses are starting to come out too.
Superb.
Anyway, we'll make it a date.
That sounds
great. Let me know when you're in the city next, and we'll try and get together.
Thanks, Gil. Great to chat.
And that was Sebastian Smee. His reviews go up pretty often on the Washington Post, along with his Great Works in Focus series. We will work on a better title for that. His website is sebastiansmee.com, which is Sebastiansmee.com. He's on Twitter as Sebastian Smee, all one word, and on Instagram as Sebastian.Smee, all spelled the same way. And there'll be links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one, along with a direct link to the Great Works series. I also, like I said, enjoyed the heck out of The Art of Rivalry, but I will note that it is back-ordered online, so I read it by Kindle. If you do the same thing, I advise also getting it on the Kindle app on your tablet. Get the Kindle app on your tablet and read it there. So when you do it that way, you can check out the artworks that are referenced, because if you do them on a regular Kindle, it's a black and white screen, low res, you can't really see them. There's only about a dozen or so pieces of art, but they look so much better on, in my case, an iPad. Oh, also the net loss piece I referred to, that's from an Australian magazine called Quarterly. I got a Kindle version of that issue too, and I thought Sebastian made some pretty good points about the nature of our attention and what it means to be part of the algorithm, to be fodder, I guess. Anyway, I'll have a link to that in the notes for this one too. Now, you can support the Virtual Memory Show by just telling other people about it. Tell them there's this guy doing these interviews every single week with creative folk like writers, artists, critics, cartoonists, publishers, musicians, translators, all sorts of people who've had interesting lives and have kind of neat stories to tell. You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or art exhibition, museum, piece of theater, whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, by postcard or letter. If you subscribe to my weekly email, you can find my mailing address at the bottom of that, or you can hit me up for it. I send postcards every day to people now because I just love doing it. And, that's my thing. Anyway, the other way you can leave a message for me is to use my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. And that goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in a conversation with me. Messages can only be 3 minutes long, so if you're going to go super long, call back, leave a second message. I'll string it all together. Also, let me know when you leave a message if it's okay to use the message in an upcoming episode of the show. Some people call, but they explicitly do not want their message to go on the podcast. But if you've got something you want to tell me and that you want to share with the listeners, just let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I'm doing okay. Day job is just fine. My expenses are pretty minimal. I do keep a Patreon. It's VMS Pod, Virtual Memory Show Podcast. I blog there every so often because people are giving me about $100 a month, so that's kind of nice. But anyway, you should help other people. Just do it through, if it's individuals, GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato-Go. There are other crowdfunding platforms you can go look for. And if you're trying to find institutions or foundations to donate to beyond political campaigns, there is your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Broad-Based Election Funds, Ukrainian relief funds. There are an awful lot of refugees there and refugees from a lot of other hotspots around the world. So what I'm saying is if you've got a little bit to spare, you can do something to help make a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.